Well, allow me to tell you a story. A young boy wanders around his village and he looks west and he sees the mighty storm clouds coming in. And he looks north and he sees hills and mountains strong as the centuries are long. And he looks east and he sees the majesty of a rising sun. He looks south and he sees and feels the wind brush gently on his cheeks. And around him he sees his parents gathering wood to set a fire to make dinner. And then he sees his uncles teaching his cousins how to ride horses, and he wonders to himself, will his own children be around such a wonderful culture and tradition? Will his grandchildren be exposed to this? So the young boy climbs to the top of the hill behind his village to see his grandfather. And he says to him, "Grandfather, grandfather, 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 I have seen the way the world works with us and us with it. But how will I know if it will continue? How will I know if my grandchildren will have this?" So the grandfather picks up the young boy and sets him on his lap, and he says to him, "Allow me to tell you a story." They both nod, smile, and laugh, and the young boy leaves. This is how I chose to start my SCE paper, and this is how I choose to start my SCE presentation, with a story. Hi, I'm Matthew Gorman. I'm here to present to you the Preservation Off of the Reservation, the Evolution of the Native American Storyteller. So I'm here to share with you a very important aspect of a culture's heritage and how it has evolved from an oral tradition into a written tradition, and how that aspect, the Native American storyteller, has worked to carry the way of life of the culture and the traditions with the weight of their words. So the idea for this project came from a class I took last spring, Native American Literature, with one of the persons and professors who I respect and admire in the highest, Dr. Olenhit. So I like this class on two levels. On an English major level, because I was reading and studying literature from a culture I had not really been exposed to that much in my life as an English major. But I also liked it on a personal mat level because it was a place of open-minded environment with friends where I could express a passion I had for a new field of interest and where I felt wholly welcome. I remember the day I met Chris Reynolds, a friend of Dr. Olenhit's, and when he came, we were in a class full of 30-plus people, and I shared with him and everyone who would listen one of my personal poems, and after which he commented on its rhythm, its sound, its pulse, and after that he shared with us some of his own art, his own heart, as he called it, and he sang songs and played music. I also remember the day I met Redtail, another friend of Dr. Olenhit's, at the Nature Center down the road, and on Redtail's arrival at the Nature Center, I shared with him and anyone else who would listen a story of one of my dogs, and after which he shared with myself and the class his own story. He shared his life story. So now I'll get to Thomas Builds a Fire a little later in the presentation, but for now I'm just going to say that I enjoyed his presence, Thomas, is when I hear his voice, and I love what he stands for and represents with life. And I enjoy picturing what he would look like, because Thomas Builds a Fire is a fictional character, but more importantly, Thomas Builds a Fire is a storyteller. So to get back to the topic at hand, storytelling, through my reading and research, I identified a few of the main roles that a storyteller would play within the culture in the old oral tradition. They were explainers, they were teachers, and they were historians. And they didn't do this just by saying words out loud or talking to people with their own thoughts and opinions and stuff. They did this through the most ultimate tool, the power of stories. So I began my research with a text entitled Native American Stories of the Sacred by Evan T. Pritchard, who was also a Native American. And this text is a collection of short stories that were compiled from several different nations. But what makes this text very special to the research project is that each of the stories did not have a singular person attributed author. They were stories that came from the nations. They were stories that came from the people that storytellers would, they were examples of what storytellers would tell for their listeners And they had examples of how they would exemplify the role of the explainer. They had creation stories, they had fire origin stories, and it had why stories, as the ones stated above. Personally, one of my favorites was a story that was not found in the text. It was a story that Dr. Olenhit told orally, and that was the story of otter bringing laughter. So in the old tradition, the storyteller would speak to a gathered crowd or even to a single individual. So oftentimes as individuals we ask ourselves, why is this the way it is, or how did this come to be? Well, storytellers were the ones who had the answers. All you had to do was listen. So they weren't only explainers, as I said, they were also teachers. They had a significant role in the participation of the upbringing of children and the nation as a whole. Though the previous text has several examples that I can talk about, I thought it would be best to bring in other authors that I looked into, which is where I got into Black Elk and Black Elk Speaks. So within this text, Black Elk Speaks, we see Black Elk taking on the role of the storyteller as a teacher while with his story of High Horse's courting, which is an example that shows and teaches the readers and the audience morals and lessons. For example, this one story of High Horse's courting would teach the readers and audience that even in patriarchal cultures, that men should value and respect women, that fathers should not only value and respect women, but also protect their daughters with their best intention, and also that even in patriarchal cultures, women should value and respect themselves and have a significant role to play. It also teaches the listeners that any goal worth obtaining is worth more than your best effort. So these concepts, lessons, and morals are transferable to other situations. This is just one story that showcases them. So we see how storytellers use stories to work and develop the nation from its infancy to its childhood and even into its adulthood. The last major role that I identified with through my reading and research is that of a storyteller as the historian. So I kept working with Black Elk Speaks with this part because it is the text that has Black Elk tracking the history of his people from the 1860s through the 1950s, and it's Black Elk taking on the role of a storyteller with Neihart, the person who he had the conversations with, translated and recorded them into the text, and the readers as his audience, telling the story of how the American government and people were trying to rid the Native Americans from their land and culture. They came with shovels and guns, and storytellers got caught in the crossfire. So I identify this text as the defining moment between the oral tradition and the written tradition, because the text Black Elk Speaks is not only a novel, but it is a recording of the conversations between Black Elk and Neihart and a few of the other Native American characters that Black Elk brings in. So this is when we see the emergence of Native American writers rather than Native American speakers, where we insert good old boy Sherman Alexie, and by extension Thomas Builds the Fire. The two texts I looked at with Sherman Alexie were The Lone Ranger and Tonto, Fistfight in Heaven, which is a collection of short stories, and a novel, Reservation Blues, which tracks the story of Thomas Builds the Fire, Victor, and a few of their friends forming a Native American blues and rock and roll band, and how they attempted to achieve their goals. And this was, I also chose this text because it tracks Thomas Builds the Fire as a storyteller and his role in the development of the characters that he is involved with and he interacts with. And this is where and when I discovered and realized the crux of my project. So I set out and expected to find the removal of the storyteller in place of a more modern assimilation and adaptation into white culture, but what I found was the complete opposite. The two texts that I chose with Sherman Alexie didn't show the destruction or the removal of the storyteller into white culture, but more how the original oral tradition is preserved through writing and the creation of storyteller characters. Alexie writes the above short stories as an act or a call for the return of the original storyteller in oral tradition, and he does this mostly through Thomas Bilzefire, but also some other Native American characters within the text. So when we look at the three sets of texts, Native American stories of the sacred, it represents the old oral tradition as example stories, and how Black Elk Speaks represents the transition moment between the written and the oral and the written traditions, and then with Sherman Alexu we have the final conclusion and evolution of storytellers existing as characters. So in conclusion, I identified the transition of Native American storytellers from the oral tradition into the written tradition as a real-life person to a written character replicating that life. So now I'd like to tell you one more story. A man descends a hill after speaking with his grandfather, who told him funny and sad stories from the times of his own grandfather. The man reaches the bottom, and he looks west, north, east, and south, and he sees all of his relatives in slacks and ties and single-colored dresses. The man goes home, and he sits down at a table and begins to write. His grandson comes up to him with a picture book from the old times, and he shows his grandfather, the man who descended the hill, and asks him to read to him. The man looks at the book, sets down his pen, and picks up his grandchild and says to him, "Grandson, if you would like to learn more from this time, you will have to listen, and I will tell you a story."